Hello and welcome to Maiden, Matriarch with me, Louise Perry. My guest today is Stephen Blackwood. He's a philosopher, an academic, the founder of Ralston College, which is a new liberal arts college in Savannah, Georgia. We started today by speaking about one of Stephen's particular interests, which is architecture, and what brutalist architecture tells us about a cultural malaise. We then spoke about, on that subject, subversion, how subversion has come to be considered as a good in and of itself. And in the extended part of the episode, we spoke about how both the right and the left are letting down young people and why many fewer young people should be going to university. That extended version of the episode can be found at louiseperry.substack.com, where, as always, you can find the whole back catalogue of extended episodes. You can find the bonus episodes I do fortnightly with my husband and the MMM chat community. Enjoy. Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we really can't understand the world or ourselves without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to point you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. And now onto the show. Stephen, should we start by talking about architecture? Because I've heard you speak very interestingly on brutalism and all of the sort of modernist architecture that's flowed from the brutalist movement as an insight into our cultural malaise. What would you say that brutalism tells us about where we're going wrong as a culture?
Well, I think fundamentally what a brutalist building, and again, I know there are admirers of brutalism and so on, and maybe there's something there. I think all things can, in some sense, be redeemed, but fundamentally, I think brutalist architecture says to the human being before it, you don't matter, and there is no such thing as beauty. Um, the uh, the Syrian the Syrian architect Marwel Sabuni, whose book was introduced by the late Sir Roger Scruton, says, I think, very truly that buildings don't lie. You can have I don't know, food that looks good but is unhealthy inside, or you can have all kinds of things that are deceptive in their appearances. They're not really what they are. But buildings can't lie in a certain sense. I mean, the ideas that they portray are the ideas that give rise to them. And one of the reasons that I find myself so often talking about architecture, you know, to my surprise, given that I'm not an architect, I'm not a scholar of architecture, I really know comparatively little about that. So, with all those disclaimers, I'll say that the reason that I find myself so often talking about architecture is that I think it really is one of the best ways into the dominant ideology and what its effects are in human life. We see the same ideas in architecture, in music, in art, in our political life, in the policies that shape family life or education or so on. Let's say a kind of brutalist nihilism, a kind of reductivist materialism, a kind of denial of any higher transcendent order. And I think a great and beautiful building at its best is on a human scale that interprets the viewer into a larger place. It makes sense of the world around you, and so one can think about that in terms of human scale, in terms of proportion, symmetry, harmony. But all of these, you might say, are things that it doesn't take very much imagination to see are things that we human beings, long for and need in all aspects of our lives. So I think architecture is a wonderful way in, and also a very urgent matter in our cities and city and urban and landscapes generally, because we make it, and we're not doing it well.
I don't know if you know. Do you know Samuel Hughes? Have you come across him? He's a historian of architecture, at the University of Oxford. He also works for Centre for Policy Studies, and he's a friend of mine. And we had dinner recently, and he was telling me about this thesis on why certain things in architecture are attractive to people. Because there's one argument, right, which I'm sure you're familiar with, the sort of, I guess, the progressive argument that architecture, one's liking or disliking for certain types of architecture is just a product of acculturation. It's just what you're used to. It's just what you've been told is high status, whatever. And Samuel is of the opinion that that's not true, that there are certain things that we find innately beautiful. And many of those things, interestingly, I'd never thought about it this way, but many of those things are features also of the human body and of other organic forms. For instance, symmetry is such an important part of classical architecture, basically every style of architecture right up until the post Second World War period, emphasize different kinds of symmetry. And actually, the human body and indeed other organic life forms are one of the very, very few manifestations of symmetry in nature. Like mountains aren't symmetrical, trees aren't symmetrical. It's actually quite a uniquely, it's a unique quality um, of human beings and other sort of higher animals to have that kind of visible symmetry. And similarly, things like ornamentation reminds us of that feature you so often have of, say, a church spire, where it tapers to a point, much like our fingers and our limbs taper to it. There are all of these things in beautiful architecture which imitate the human form. And I said, at the risk of sounding crazy, I said, is what you're telling me, Samuel, that modernist architecture that deliberately rejects those things, that deliberately rejects symmetry, that deliberately rejects ornamentation, all of these things, is in some sense like fundamentally anti-human, right? Is it in some sense rejecting all of the things that we find beautiful about the human form? That's what that architecture is doing. And he said yes.
Well, I entirely agree, and I think that one can go further. Even, I mean, I think see, people often want to say this kind of it's sort of a postmodern claim that, because there's a difference in how beauty is perceived. There's no such thing as beauty other than in the eye of the beholder, or there's that buildings have changed over time. There's no such thing, that no consistent form of architecture that human beings find pleasing. But the one that does not follow from the other. You can look at. I would make a bold claim. I would say that you can look at the whole history of architecture in all times and places, transculturally, transhistorically, and find that, broadly speaking, it is governed by consistent principles. And of course, there can be a big difference between what's going on in Japan and ancient Sumeria and medieval Florence or whatever. Nonetheless, you will find certain principles of symmetry, of human scale, certain integration of decorative elements within a logic that is coherent within the whole, and so on and so forth. And so, I think really what we see in brutalist architecture is an expression of a widespread ideological sort of neo-Marxist position that there is no there are no such thing as higher order goods, beauty, truth, forgiveness, justice. These are all just constructs of the will to power. And fundamentally, that position is wrong. It's not the case. And one of the reasons we know it's not the case is because these things persist consistently over time. And so, I would also go further to say that the principles that are, you might say, instantiated in architecture. You spoke, I think, very powerfully about symmetry in that regard. These are not just located in as you say, in buildings or even just in human beings. I mean, symmetry is widely found throughout living beings, throughout many animals. I live here in Savannah. It's a beautiful city in the southeastern United States, and one of its most notable features are the great live oak trees. And oak trees, though you might not call them strictly speaking symmetrical, they're profoundly dialectical in the sense that they're the weight and counterweight, like a great medieval cathedral, is what holds them up. You have these massive boughs on this side of a 250-year-old oak and massive boughs on this side, and that balance is what holds them there. And it's actually very interesting. You not infrequently see. I live just around or used to live and now work just around the corner from the main city park called Forsyth Park here in Savannah, and it's got many of these wonderful oak trees, it's beautiful and not infrequent to see young couples coming to get married by a justice of the peace in front of the greatest and biggest oak tree in the park. And one has to think, well, why is that? What in this tree is calling to them as an appropriate place to take vows of marriage to someone else? And I pose that, maybe leave that as a question, but because it makes the point that the things that we seek to embody in architecture are not only in architecture, and that our seeking them is not a matter of momentary, well, I kind of feel this way, but of something much deeper about the world and much deeper about us.
I've sadly never been to Savannah, but am I right that it's one of the cities which neoclassical architecture was particularly pursued, particularly sort of enthusiastically in the 19th century in America? I love this about that period of American history where you have like not only these incredible Grecian columns, springing up in the middle of these brand new towns and cities, but also the very ambitious naming of places. You have Athens, often like some like farming town in the middle of the Midwest or whatever. And I think that I mean, going back to this whole question about, I guess, one's relationship to tradition and to the past, that speaks of I guess you could call it a grandiosity or an ambition of that cultural moment in America, right? Of thinking, no, we are the heirs to Athens. We can name our cities after these things. And it seems to me as if we've really lost that. That's absolutely not that kind of ambition is very much absent, I would say, generally speaking.
Well, that's so well said, and I think, and first to answer your question, yes, Savannah is a very beautiful place. 1733 layout by Oglethorpe. It's an astonishingly beautiful city. I sometimes say playfully that when I say Savannah's, I'm not from here myself. I grew up in Eastern Canada, but when I say that, born in the Western Canada, so I'm from a bit all over. But so I only say that by way of a disclaimer, that not that I don't think people should be able to brag about their homes and places they're from, but in my case, because I think they should, and they should probably do more of it in our decentralized, globalized place. Attachment to home is so important. But I make the point only to say that I'm not from here, and so I come here initially as an outsider, though I've been here for almost a decade now. And I sometimes playfully say that when I say that Savannah is the most beautiful city in the United States, that's an opinion, not a fact. But when I say it's in the top 5, that's a fact. So it is an extremely beautiful place. But I want to pick up on something you said about, and that's of course the one of the primary reasons we chose it as the place to found a new college, because that experience of beauty is so important, and that experience of historically made beauty is a kind of analog of what our cultural inheritance is or can be. It speaks to the presence of beautiful things in the past, and it can inspire us to be somehow worthy of that. And I think you've sort of struck on a really important dynamic, Louise. Of course, there's a kind of ambition to build something beautiful, but there's also a kind of humility. There's a kind of humility in saying, gosh, if I could just somehow leave something behind that would be worthy of the things that others gave to me. In a way, that's what should be a fundamental ambition of all of us. And they're always, this is, I think, one of the myths of the present, is that somehow to look forward, or to build anew, or to solve problems in the present means only looking forward. But in fact, you can only look forward by looking back, and only sort of navigate your future by knowing who and what you are. And there's a real sense in which architecture, again, is a great sort of example or metaphor of that. You have the neoclassical, the founding fathers, people like Jefferson, and others in the 18th and 19th century. They're in some sense imitating earlier patterns like Palladio, a great Renaissance architect. Palladio's imitating what he reads from Vitruvius from the ancient world, and Vitruvius is looking back to an earlier time. And even if you go to places like Delphi and these early places of temples in Greece, there's a clearly a sense in which the temple is itself imitating the great trees and groves of nature. And so there's always an imitative character in building anything. And so you might say it's ambition in the one sense, but it's also a kind of, humility to give ourselves over and try to be worthy of the things that we have ourselves been given.
I cannot actually reinvent the wheel, essentially. I am indebted to all of these people who've come before me. Yes. Whereas what brutalism and similar sorts of experimental architecture do is they say no. Why? They would call it pastiche, wouldn't they? They're very. Are you familiar with Poundbury, the town in the southwest of England, which is the it's built on land owned by the now king when he was Prince of Wales, and it's built at sort of under his direction because he loves classical architecture. And so Poundbury was designed to look like a Georgian town, except with some modern, it's more car friendly than most Georgian towns would be, and so on. But the whole idea behind it is to basically imitate exactly this type of architecture and urban design that people apparently really like. And so many architects and other sort of cultural critics are so rude about Poundbury. So rude about Poundbury. They say that it's like a little theme park, that it's, incredibly embarrassing, all of this. But you know what? One, I've been to Poundbury and it's charming. And two, it commands very high house prices relative to the area. I mean, people have decided that they would much rather live in Poundbury than live in any of the surrounding areas. Basically, like it clearly pleases people in a way that displeases most architects, because pastiche obviously is or even parody is the word that they would
Oh yeah,
prefer,
but I mean,
rather
yeah.
than homage or yes, whichever other word.
Yes, no, exactly. I'm glad you brought that up because it really brings up the distasteful and disgusting snobbery of a certain kind of elite that really knows nothing about the things that he or she thinks he or she knows about. And so what you have is this, and I think really what's going on is resentment. Fundamentally, there's a mix of different things. One is resentment because this actually is a building people would want to live in, versus the things that I, out of my own vanity, build. There's also, I think, a profound vanity going on that in which there's this kind of Luciferian instinct. Either I matter in relation to things that are transcendent and greater than I am, or that is an intolerable reality, and therefore I have to deny or try to undermine those things that are in fact greater than I am. And I think that that's fundamentally what's going on in this sort of spirit of contemporary architecture, not in all architecture by any means, or all architects, but insofar as it sets itself up against the whole history of what human beings have built in the past, and tries to bring about an absolute rupture with that. I see nothing. There's little in that to admire or emulate, just in principle. But we see the same thing in other areas. We see the same things with respect to the relation between the sexes. One of the most foundational things of any human civilization, as if human cultures haven't figured out a thing or two about it, or education, or political life, or the arts more broadly, or how to foster a lively and flourishing human community. These are all things that human beings have been at since what? I think in your book you say that we've been evolving for 200,000 years. Is the number you give? The pretense of thinking that we haven't figured, there's nothing to learn from that past, is not only staggeringly hubristic, but fundamentally tragic, because what it does is it cuts you off from the answers that you yourself are desperately looking for.
And I say this as someone who used to basically think that. I mean, it's an incredibly adolescent mindset, actually. It really does typify the teenager sort of lashing out against the parents or whatever. And yet, amazingly, it has become really the idea that subversion is a good in and of itself is so widely believed in the most establishment circles. It's amazing. And I basically believed that, I guess, up until maybe my early 20s, because it's, of course, it's what students are taught at universities, mostly, at many schools. Increasingly, the sort of propaganda efforts begin very, very early in life. You would not believe the amount of propaganda on the walls of the local children's library, for instance, near our home in London. Um, yes, subversion as a goal seems to explain, well, I don't we can get into this, why exactly subversion has become a goal. But given that prior, I think, explains so much of what we see in everything from architecture to education to gender relations, etc. um, my question, I don't know if I have an answer to this or if there is a clear answer to this, but why why did we invent this idea, and why has it become so incredibly popular?
Well, I think that's a great question. I'm not going to pretend that I uh, have anything like an adequate answer to such a powerful and trenchant and urgent question. But if one thinks about what subversion is, I think it's closely related to cynicism. It's closely related to a sense that there is no there. That it's just a you know the endless will to power of all against all and each against each and so on. And you know subversion is fundamentally about, well, what does it mean, to put something under, to tear it down, to wreck it, to burn it, to destroy it. It's the what is the antithesis of subversion? The antithesis would be to build, to steward, to caretake, to love, um, to transmit, to cherish, let's say. And I think one can get into all kinds of the history or genealogy of the dominant ideology is of course it's a matter I'm very interested in, and there's some wonderful and elucidating books written on this, indeed, even recently, and we could talk about those. um, I don't think there's any secret that, broadly speaking, this intellectual, so to speak, this intellectual superstructure which goes through a number of iterations, in a way traces itself back to Nietzsche and Marx, and there's lots to be said about that. But ideas are not a sufficient. They're not a sufficient account of how we end up where we are. They are in a way they're they can often be drivers, often they're interpreters, but they're not in a vacuum, is what I would say. And so the question is, well, what else is at work? Well, there have to be human incentives at work, whether it's the lust for power, which of course has always been with us, whether it's material cultural things. I think a lot of the alienation and disillusionment, that the disenchantment, as some would say, that people feel does have, it's not merely coming from ideas that are in the air. Those are very, very powerful, or in the water or whatever, and we could talk more about those, because I think we fundamentally need to recover a vision of life that is true, rather than one that, so if cynicism were indeed or nihilism were indeed and truthful account of our relation to reality, it were somehow the best way, the most adequate way of a human being engaging with the world, then you'd say, well, that it's good to stick with it, actually, because you're going to do better operating out of what's true than what isn't out of true. You don't want to live in a fantasy, but in fact, it's not true. There are persistent goods that we can rationally come to know and love and intuit in our lives, and build our cultures and center them around them. And so, what I'm trying to get at here fundamentally is that the 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 will to subvert has an intellectual backdrop, for sure, It has no doubt some backdrop in human nature, our own Lucifers within us. My mother, I come from a family of 10 children, and my mother always said, among many other wise things and observations she has, is that you don't have to teach your kids to lie. And so, I think the idea that we're just a blank good slate, the Rousseauian idea, that's false. And so, there's in us a will to destroy. That's in all of us. Let's not pretend it's otherwise. And then there are these material cultural things, the disruptions of long throughout the long run of history of human beings, from the communities that root them, through vast changes in travel, in technology. So all of these material cultural forces that actually bring about a fragmented world, are part of the reason people think there is only fragments in atomism, because those material cultural forces have played a role in actually dislocating us. And so, I think it's a complicated phenomenon. What I find absolutely unforgivable, though, is the way in which many people who should know better continue to promote ideologies that are fundamentally toxic to human beings.
So I should say, I generally am. I'm not a Marxist, but I am a historical materialist. In that, I generally think that the best explanation for any given historical phenomenon is a material one, and there are material factors that I'm sure we could look to in relation to architecture. I would tend to intellectual history is very interesting. I tend to think that like I don't know, like Marcuse or someone like that, who's credited with being very influential in bringing us to where we are. I haven't read Marcuse. I went to one of the most left wing universities in the country. Almost no one has read these people, right? So the chances of these intellectuals being the key, it's probably more likely that they're pushing on an open door. Um, but okay. So some of the material factors that might explain it, but I'm about to say I'm not sure if they take us the whole way. I think there probably is some sort of intellectual, spiritual, something else that's going on. Maybe the incredibly rapid pace of technological change over since the Industrial Revolution really has changed people's lives so utterly, and has meant that elderly people now are less capable of providing wisdom on certain things. For instance, the joke is that older people just can't use smartphones, can't use computers and whatever. And like, they can't, because they haven't lived with these things for very long. And so on certain things, and maybe this is almost historically unique, the young are at an advantage relative to the old in terms of familiarity with our new technological landscape. And so maybe that encourages us to discredit the wisdom of older people. It's one possibility. Maybe there's also something to do with, I look at the worst buildings. It's like, say, in a city like Oxford, which I'm familiar with, which contains some of the most beautiful buildings in the country, maybe in the world. Also, some of the worst, some of the hideous buildings, right? So many of these hideous buildings are basically built by committee in some way. They're built by either sort of university authorities or by the local or by local government. And there's some sense in which no one actually involved in building this structure really takes credit for it. That all of the praise and the blame is so diffuse that no one feels any sense of either accomplishment or shame at having built this terrible thing. Whereas maybe in the past, when you had individual philanthropists paying for buildings, maybe sometimes they had terrible taste, but more often that they would take pride in a building being beautiful, and they would insist on it being beautiful. So maybe there's something to do with democracy in government, making that sort of decision making more diffuse. Also, the fact that we have more buildings built by the state now, that as the state has grown larger. I'm throwing these things out there. I can't help, though, but come to the conclusion that basically this sets in the architecture factor, and everything else really sets in post Second World War. And so maybe there is some spiritual crisis that the West experiences post Second World War, which has to explain some of it. I don't know. I'm sorry. I've just thrown lots of different possibilities at you, and I'm not really confident of any of them.
Well, I'd love to respond to those. I think that you're, though I'm not a, did you call yourself a historical materialist? I wouldn't describe myself that way. I would never want to uh, make light of how profoundly that gives that kind of interpretation gives a very necessary account uh, of our lives and the world around us. And I mean, to deny that would be to kind of sort of early Christian heresy, so-called heresy called Gnosticism, which which makes it seem as if the body doesn't matter and so on. I mean, the I think one of the true things that our age sees is how much our embodied reality does matter, although it is a very conflicted relation to that, or how much the material role, the materiality, the material conditions of our lives can have an effect on them. So I think all of that is, although it's a very rich and complicated question, I think all of that is true. Though I would, I think it needs to be said that as I think you are here saying, Louise, that this say through the architectural crisis, let's say, that's a pretty recent thing in human history, and it doesn't seem to be an accident that it takes place, as you say, largely in the 20th century. Though I would say that the influences that lead to the deterioration of architecture do begin earlier, but nonetheless, the 20th century, it's no secret, it's an awful lot to answer for. The bloodiest century in human history has led to perhaps the most suffering of any time, and yet it is the most hubristic. It thinks of itself as a time of progress, when in fact, by any kind of fair measure, or by many fair measures, it's just the opposite. I also want to point to another dynamic here. I think that surely, built by committee, built by the state, these are all factors. But I want to recollect the fact that, many of the buildings that are regarded as most beautiful, let's say the Gothic cathedrals, for example, are a good example of this, were built over something like and often more than a century. And let's just think about what that means. I mean, first, it means that no single human being could possibly have presided start to finish over and taken credit for its work. It also means that those who laid the foundation stones knew that they would not finish it, and those who finished it knew that they had not begun it. And so it points towards at least in that period, a trans historical value of what this building is. And, I think it's not too many jumps or steps to see that speaks towards an orientation in at least those people at that point in time around something that they regarded as transcendent. And that belief, and we can leave to another later come in the conversation whether those transcendent things are actually real, but they thought they were real. And it's a big philosophical question that I think is not actually as complicated as people think. But what I'm trying to make clear here is how dominant, how powerful, how influential that view is. And I think that what many young people are living with today is the consequences of a kind of nihilism in themselves. So if you teach people, unlike, say, those who built the Gothic cathedrals, who thought that they were participating in something of transcendent importance, and that their labor, let's put it in sort of somewhat economic or even Marxist terms, that their labor was contributing to something of transcendent value. We're leaving Marx a long way behind here now, but just to use that their actual time and treasure was oriented to something bigger and beyond them. Let's say, what you get if you deny all of that, you end up in a world in a world that denies that there is any transcendent goods, beauty, truth, forgiveness, redemption, whatever. What that leads to psychologically is a world in which there is no possibility of any redemption in any relationship, that there's only darkness everywhere, like it's your own power or someone else's. And what that does is it darkens the horizon for, like what you think you can become, what you are as a human being, what your possibilities and prospects are, what a life ahead of you, the life that stretched ahead of you as a young person, what can you hope for in that? And the answer is nothing. It's effectively, that's what brutalism as an internalized subjectivity means. There is nothing ahead of you but darkness and stone and concrete walls. And so I'm not saying that there aren't profound historical materialist realities that we're always living in relation to, only that the spiritual or intellectual conception of our own selves, even if they were false, that these ideas were false and true, which is another question, though they are not. A little bit of a spoiler here. Even if they were false, it's unbelievably influential.
Atheism produces bad architecture.
I think, as a matter, I've never thought of it that way, but as a matter of fact, I would say that is true. Let's say a denial of the transcendent produces bad architecture very consistently over the last 100 years. Also, bad family life, bad education, bad relationships, bad geopolitical situations, and so on and so forth.
Well, let's get on to some of that as well, because as well as a student of architecture, you are of course an educator, and you are interacting with young people every day in your professional role, and it seems to me, I wonder if you agree, that not just in terms of teaching young people that subversion is a good in and of itself. That's one example. There are so many ways in which our culture does not do right by young people, doesn't tell them the truth, essentially, at the moment that they need to hear it. We force. I dedicated my first book to the women who learnt it the hard way. It could just as easily be applied to men as well. I think that we force young people to learn so many things the hard way because we would prefer to do that rather than tell them the truth. Do you agree? How do you see the sort of cultural messaging that young people are receiving?
Well, it's pretty bad in a lot of very fundamental and influential ways. Um, you know, my heart really goes out to young people, to be completely candid. I think that a vast amount of the call it the messaging or the culture, the environment they're in, is very unhealthy, toxic, counter to their interests. And I think that that's true at many levels. And again, I'm not a catastrophist in the sense that I think, oh, it was always better than it is now, and we should burn it all down today. I mean, antibiotics and clean running water and all kinds of other things. Uh, uh, the emancipation of people who were formerly enslaved, although that has not happened around the world anything like the way people want to think of it. These are all, unmitigated goods, and we should be thankful for them. We should not. Uh, uh, we should not pretend or that the past was in every respect superior, or even assume that it was superior. But we should not assume that our own time has got it all figured out. And from my observation, Louise, I would just maybe list four ways that the dominant culture or the dominant ideology or ideologies profoundly ill serves young people and indeed all of us. But the first is the one we've touched on. I think the dominant nihilism is absolutely toxic to human life. It takes away your hope of the future, your possibility of a meaningful life, your possibility of reciprocity in relationships. And what do you have as a young person? I mean, you haven't built much yet. I mean, what do you have? You have your future to look forward to, and your the prospect of building a life that you can regard as worth living. And that's not possible according to any kind of nihilistic standard. There's no meaning outside of your own arbitrary will. And so I think it cuts off the tree at the roots, you might say. So that's the first thing. Second, and I know that many people have written about this very illuminatingly, technology. I think that we're living at a real crisis of our relation to technology. Most obviously, you might say, with respect to the smartphone and the way in which the dopaminergic patterns of the human mind or brain are exploited by vast multinational corporate interests, the way in which human attention is commodified and monetized. This is There is no sense in which this is in any way in the interests of the human being, him or herself. And so I think that we have had a whole generation of young people fundamentally made into cannon fodder for certain kinds of short-term, narrow corporate interests. And so what that produces, of course, I mean, Jonathan Haidt and others have written about this. I mean, a crisis of anxiety, rise in suicide, a crisis of attention, in which your whole orientation is towards little blips and things on the screen and short-term dopaminergic shots into your mind, or whatever, your brain, so to speak. But what that does is it robs you of so much, right? First, it takes away the time that you could have spent doing something valuable. So, the amount of time that the average young person spends on social media, for example, or on the phone in various other capacities, is not half an hour here and there. It's dozens of hours a week for many people. Well, I mean, in that time, I mean, you could become fluent in Chinese or French, or you could master the violin or the piano or the saxophone or whatever. You could become a great, globally renowned bread baker. I'm just throwing out different things. I mean, the point of the matter is that particularly in these early years of formation, it makes an enormous difference what you invest your time in, because that's sort of the self you have to take into your 20s and find a spouse if you want one, and to help yourself to become gainfully employed, and to interpret and understand the world. What are the tools you have? And your childhood and your teens in particular are a time in which you can really make enormous investments in the person that you then are for the rest of your life. And so I think that the technology is profoundly betraying, you might say, the time, the resource that human beings have to invest in the lives they want to live. And then, of course, the distraction of attention has many other causes, or deleterious effects, insofar as it alienates it from ourselves, and makes it harder to set goals, makes it harder to connect with other people. Famously, we see people, that feeling lonely as they are sitting at a table with the people that they actually want to connect with, but all of them on their phones. And so it has all kinds of other knock-on effects. So I'd say nihilism ideologically. I'd certainly say the technology is big. I think the advice young people get about career and about how to make choices is really bad, and especially in a kind of middle to upper class, let's say, register of our culture. The young people are very strongly concerned to instrumentalize their own lives, to approach everything as if it's about their career. Now, I would not for a moment say, I mean, I'm someone who has to be gainfully employed myself. I don't have generational wealth to sustain me. Um, uh, so I absolutely understand the need that we all have to navigate the world, to be able to find shelter and nutritional and food, and safety, and all those things, and being gainfully employed is part of that. But young people are, and I see this as a kind of epidemic in the United States, are encouraged to approach their own choices at the most important time for them to make those choices in a purely instrumental way. And what that leads to is, it leads to fundamentally to self-alienation. They end up making choices that are not the choices they should have made. And those are big choices, because they lead them down paths for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And so I think it's actually very, very important that young people be encouraged to make their big choices on the basis of their deepest intuitions of what they are and are made for, and what they hope to become. And the problem with that is that those deep intuitions are often not uh, uh, things you can put clearly into defensible arguments as to why you're doing this. And so, what are you going to do with that? People will ask. But the fact of the matter is that the most important things in life often begin that way. They begin as intuition or quiet perceptions in a still small moment. You think, you know. I think maybe, and those are the things that lead to the big yeses that lead to a life that you can I think to a life that you will regard yourself as worth living. So I think young people are very poorly served in terms of the way they're taught to think about their careers, and then ultimately, I think unbelievably badly served with respect to how they're encouraged to think about relationships. And I this is a topic in which you are obviously an expert. And have given a great deal of thought and invested much research. But broadly speaking, I think that they're encouraged to think about the other sex if they're straight in ways that are profoundly unlikely to make them into people, or to make them into people who are able to find and attract the kind of person they would themselves really like to spend their lives with. And so I think that whether this has to do with hypersexualization and pornography, or whether it has to do with pretty widespread ideas of kind of hatred of women or hatred of men. These are pretty widespread, but it turns out it's not a good way to teach, to preach, treat is the word I'm looking for here, to treat someone if you want them to be your partner in a life of reciprocity. Approaching them with cynicism and anger and hatred, whether it's man to woman or woman to man, or man to man or woman to woman. That's just a very bad way to go about it. And so, orienting young people with regard to how they can navigate and become the people who are worthy of and able to enter into relationships of deep reciprocity that they seek and will be happy to have. And again, I'm not telling anyone what they might want, but broadly speaking, human beings seek those things. I think those are four areas in which our culture is very profoundly letting our young people down.
Yes, and it strikes me that one common factor there is the loss of social guardrails. Is I I think it's Jordan Peterson actually who said this years ago, and it stuck with me because it was such a great way of framing it. He said something like, if you are going to behave differently from everybody else, you should have an extraordinarily good reason to do so. Because probably actually, and I would apply this as well to modern civilization, full stop, right? If you are going to construct, say, institutions or norms or laws which are extraordinarily different from those that have existed in other times and places, you should have an extraordinarily good reason to do so. Going back to this point about subversion, right? And I think that this applies as well to things like relationships, to career paths. There are some people who are outliers. There are some people for whom the white picket fence route, let's say, is not the best route, but they are by definition unusual. Most people will do best if they aspire towards the sort of normal life course. But then the problem, of course, is what is that? What are we? I think this is particularly true for women, because we've had this influx of middle class women into the workforce over the last several decades, but we haven't. But what we've done is we've basically just offered these young women a masculine life template. We've said that you'll go through all this career sequence. Fine, that's basically that template is basically mapped out. But where on earth are you supposed to fit marriage and children into that template? I mean, you're not really, because there isn't that recognition that masculine and feminine life courses are different by virtue of reproduction. And so I'm sure you've seen these many polls are so depressing that ask young people, what do you aspire to, what aspirations do you have in life? And they will, if pressed, say things like, I'd like to have children, I'd like to have a partner, obviously all the normal things. But what they'll also say, particularly in relation to career, is, I want to be a celebrity, I want to be a YouTube star, I want to seek this sort of route of decadence, you know, as a goal in and of itself. I say this, of course, as a podcaster. If any of my children came to me and said, "Mummy, when I grow up, I want to be a podcaster," I would say, "No, you don't. That's a ridiculous aspiration." I never intended to do any of this. It all ended up kind of being accidental. And the idea that this should be a standard route seems wild to me. But then also, what else really would you expect from teenagers? I mean, that teenagers are bad at long-term planning. That's why they need adults to guide them. But we have this inversion where adults don't want to do that, and so we kind of leave them to their own devices. The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.